On Monday morning, March 27, 2023, three 9-year-old kids and three adults were gunned down by a shooter who opened fire at the Covenant Presbyterian Church school in Nashville, Tennessee. The children were students. The adults were staff members. One little girl, Hallie, was the daughter of the lead pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church, which is connected to the school. We've learned that the shooter was receiving treatment for an emotional disorder, but was able to legally purchase 7 weapons, including the 2 AR-15 type rifles and a handgun used in the school shooting from 5 local gun stores. Her motives for the slaughter were not immediately made clear. The massacre was just the latest in a chain of shootings that just over the last year have left dozens dead and injured in attacks in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, California, Chesapeake, Virginia, Colorado Springs, Highland Park, Illinois, Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, among other places. As in Nashville, researchers found that shooters tend to alarm people around them, often signaling their plan in advance. Generally, they purchase their weapons legally. After the Nashville tragedy, the chaplain of the U.S. Senate urged lawmakers to move beyond thoughts and prayers. President Biden said he had exhausted his executive powers to deal with guns and said Congress should pass an assault weapons ban, saying there's a moral price to pay for inaction. But Republican lawmakers demonstrate little or no support for that legislation. They control the House and reiterated their opposition to actions that would restrict access to guns, saying that mental health issues are the root cause of the gun violence problem in America. That's why today, attorney, author, and Justice Counts podcast host Mark Bello and I are proud to present clinical psychologist Dr. Emily Bashah and political expert Paul Johnson, former mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. They're co-authors of Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency. Emily frequently serves as an expert witness in court and has worked on high-profile cases covering issues of domestic terrorism and capital offenses. Paul was the youngest mayor in Phoenix, Arizona history when he was elected at age 30. He was sued by the NRA for implementing common sense gun laws. Welcome, Emily and Paul. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
What an intro. It's nice to meet both of you. Obviously, this subject is top of mind for most Americans today. A couple of days ago, on March 29th, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Press, and I asked why Republicans care so much about the Second Amendment, but are so apathetic or antagonistic even to the First. The reference obviously is to book banning, and the op-ed is entitled, "A Book Never Killed 6 People in 15 Minutes." So here's my question, which either of you can answer. What will it take for this country to take meaningful action to protect the lives of innocent people from mass shootings, like this Nashville event? And why is the GOP so keen on protecting kids from certain books, but so pathetic when it comes to protecting them from automatic weapons like AR-15s?
Because this is more of a political question, I'll give the opening on this. I spent a lot of time on gun issues, violence issues. Back in the 1990s when I was mayor, we had a series of incidents, drive-by shootings, gang shootings. But one of the big incidents that we had was a case where a group of, I think, 9 young people went into a skating rink, all of them between the ages of 11 and 14 years old. They had guns strapped to their hips. When they got inside, they opened fire, rival gangs opened fire on one another, killing a couple of kids and maiming a number of others. There was a police officer literally at the site, and I asked why they didn't stop them. They saw that they had guns on their hips. And the answer was, Mayor, it's legal for people to have guns on their hips. And I said, these kids were 14 years old. The answer was the law didn't distinguish. I went out and put a number of different measures in place. I might add, you had mentioned in the intro that I was sued by the NRA. I actually put into place a curfew program, which was very effective, a school uniform program, and a kids gun law all at one time. And I ended up being sued literally in, I think, the same month by the NRA and the ACLU. I used to call myself an equal opportunity defendant because I both groups on both sides upset. The NRA's argument was it was a slippery slope. My argument was it was 14-year-old kid. Now, we ended up getting some help from Janet Reno and a number of other mayors throughout the country, and we began to pass kids gun laws across the country. I'm not going to tell you that alone resolved the problem, but what I will tell you is that between those three measures, we saw about a 70% reduction in violent crimes and drive-by shootings in the city of Phoenix. I personally think that it was a combination of measures. I think it is important to have measures that we implement psychologically to help young people. I think that's an important role. And I think that guns have to play a role as well. I like to go by the data as opposed to the emotions. Now, have proposed in the past that we try to eliminate assault weapons, but what I can tell you is that we haven't made a lot of progress on that. Bill Clinton ended up getting a ban for about a decade, and then that went back out of place. I'm not sure that we're going to be successful on that. And if we are successful, I'm not sure that we're going to see the results that we hope that we'll see. I can tell you gun legislation that we know does work. Here's the first one: safe containment laws. When Bill Clinton did his ban, it was an interesting question that the actual rate of violence utilizing weapons went down by about 30%. One of the things with assault weapons went down by 30%. Now, you could argue that was because they banned it. But the truth was there were still a lot of guns out there at the time. In the United States today, we have about 20 million assault weapons out there. About 1 in 20 people own an assault weapon, and 1 in 4 sales of guns today are an assault weapon. I think what happened, I think there's pretty good evidence that says that what happened is that people were afraid that government was going to come take their guns. And so they hid them. And when you hide them, you're also hiding them from your children. You're hiding them from kids. If you look at the data, there's a case study that Emily can talk about, but there are 180 shootings that have happened on campuses and in churches. And there's a whole set of similarities that you can find in the data. One of them is they're almost all young white men with the exception of 5 cases. They are, in all of the cases, you will find that they were young people young males who ended up getting their hands on a weapon, usually, not always, but usually not by purchasing them, usually by taking them home. And usually they came from the school that the shooting actually took place in. The point I would give to you is if you start with making certain that weapons are stored correctly and creating penalties when they're not. Number 2, red flag laws. Red flag laws work. The idea that you identify someone who's been involved in domestic violence or been involved in criminal act, you not only flag them, but you end up training the bureaucracy to make certain that the information gets out so that people who are selling weapons have them on a no-buy list. And the third thing that I think works are restraining orders. The idea that you have 4 or 5 people in a family that know that someone is on edge, and you create a restraining order for them to be able to buy weapons, and you get them on that same list, which there are some states that have begun to implement those. Those 3 things, I think you're going to see are more effective combined with psychological help and support. And I'll let Emily talk about that portion of it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Paul just mentioned there is a really important study that came out in a book that was published in 2021. It's called The Violence Project. I highly recommend it. And they looked at how to stop a mass shooting epidemic. So these authors, they're Julian Peterson and James Densley. They're professors of criminology and criminal justice. They're both parents of children in elementary school. And in their view, they see that there's a failure to gain a more meaningful and evidence-based approach and understanding to why mass shootings are happening in schools and in community. And they see them as this lost opportunity to stop the next one from happening. And they gathered a large amount of data. They started looking at shooters ever since the year of 1966 who shot and killed 4 more people in public places. And they looked at personal factors, they looked at psychological factors, other contextual factors to help try and really profile, like, what does the shooter look like? What are the warning signs that Paul was mentioning before? These people do tend to flag people who know them, who love them, who care about them, whether it's teachers or parents or other peers or other people in the community that they share their suicidal beliefs with or homicidal beliefs with or risks of violence fantasies, and that they're really in a place of despair impacted by childhood trauma or historical trauma. And it's a cry for help. And if people around them are not taking them seriously, and I see this all the time in the forensic work that I do as a clinical psychologist, that there are people who are forewarned and yet they don't take the steps to protect that person. And oftentimes I hear, even in like crisis management situations that I'm placed in, I'm actually going through a crisis that occurred yesterday, trying to also situate safety and stabilization of someone who is at risk to themselves and the public. Oftentimes people around them are fearful of reporting them. And sometimes they're legal teams that I'm working with, sometimes they're parents that are involved and other family members. And oftentimes I hear these people saying, I just don't want them to get in trouble. I just don't want them to get in trouble with the law. They already have a lot going on. I know they verbalize this, but they really don't mean it. And I'm saying, listen, I'm a psychologist and we have data and science helping us really interpret and understand risk factors. And right now they're at high risk to harm themselves. If you love them and care about them, you need to call the crisis center, call the crisis line, and have professionals come out to really be able to assess them. Contact your local mental health services. If you're not even sure, where those numbers are, call 911. That if this is a person you love and care about.
Dr. Bashah, you might also add to that. I know that big portion of their study was that they identified almost all 180 as suicide victims, as people who were looking to commit suicide.
Yeah, so suicidal ideation and risk for suicide. So things that we look at involve intent, planning, if they had any like past suicidal attempts, and all of these things helped to assess whether or not this person is at imminent risk of committing suicide. So people who are homicidal and are also suicidal are more at risk because they really have nothing to live for. At that point, part of their planning may even involve suicide or death by cop. And especially if they want to go out with a bang or leave some kind of remembrance or have some kind of name or legacy that they're trying to leave behind. There are also some other factors that are linked, such as childhood trauma, or if they have a motive, especially towards a group that they feel has wronged them. They have a sense of justification and condoning the acts of violence, and a sense of betrayal from community, isolation, a loss of identity, lack of belonging, and a sense of being with community are also some really important risk factors.
Paul, as you mentioned a minute ago that 1 in 20 Americans own a AR-15 type weapon, an assault weapon of some fashion or another. What's the attraction of those guns?
I think it's the macho gun of the day, right?
Yeah.
It's the gun that says, I'm a man. I'm tough. I'm one of the people willing to stand up for my rights and who I am. So it definitely is both a political statement and I think a statement of identity that is involved with it. I also think, and this is just, look, in the end, people sometimes hate politics. I tend to love politics. I think politics is the place where we go to try to resolve our problem. Don't have a negative view of it. I do know that there are times when you're dealing with political issues that you just quite simply have to figure out what is the lay of the land, what can you get done to make a difference. Now, again, with the AR-15, I don't own an AR-15. I don't even have a desire to own an AR-15. As I said, I don't know that we're going to get the results out of banning them that we might think that we would get. But the bigger question should be, how do we make progress on this in a way in which is backed up by data? And that was my point when I did the kids' gun law, the curfew program, and the school uniform program. I was looking for data that would help me try to actually reduce violent crimes in our city. And I'm convinced there is some common ground here, but not if the goal is to just simply poke our finger in the other person's eye. And by the way, I think the person with the AR-15, their goal is to partly poke their finger in the other person's eye. So it becomes this partisan thing that ends up becoming pushback. You have to work to try to find that common ground and at least have a belief that it's hard for me to believe that people can't watch what's going on our school campuses and not be distraught by it, regardless of what political side they happen to be on. This is a horrendous thing that we're allowing to happen to our children. It just is a horrendous thing. They've already made it clear, from what I can see, that we're going to have a hard time if we make the battle lines around banning assault weapons. But I think there is common ground that we can find with Republicans and Democrats and make movement on the issue.
What does that look like, Paul?
I think that
You say movement on the
first, I think that you find self-containment laws are supported by hunters, by the NRA. There are lots of people who support, say, self-containment laws, trying to make certain that the weapons are self-contained. The second issue is red flag laws, much more controversial, but there are a lot of Republicans who see the benefit of trying to make certain that we're identifying people who we know are a problem. Adding to that, the third issue that I think that we should add to that is the restraining order concept. The idea that, hey, I'm worried that my son's getting sucked into some ideological leaning on some issue, or they're beginning to become more erratic. I'm worried that they may go buy a gun, that somebody may sell them a gun. And you go to a judge and you say, I'm worried about this. I'd like to have a restraining order placed on them to stop that from happening. You need some legislation to be able to make that happen. But you put those three things together, along with actually working psychologically on trying to identify people who are potential victims. Emily laid out the issues that the study pointed out. They almost always start with some type of trauma. They move to this state of isolation. There are oftentimes suicide attempts, and then they externalize it. Then they begin to say, hey, these problems that I'm having are being caused by this group, by the Jewish people in the synagogue, or by the rich kids who are in the school that I couldn't get into, or by the Christians who didn't treat me the way that I wanted to be treated, whatever it is. And as they begin to externalize that and have an external enemy, they basically go on a death quest to make their last act something that gives them notice. Now, it's not hard to see. These things happen in flurries, right? One will happen and there'll be two or three right behind them. Copycatting. They're watching what happened in the other instances. Again, white males. We know that white males are much more prone to this than other people. If it were up to me, ban the sale of guns to people up to the age of 21 years old. I don't know that you could get that done, but to me, raising that age limit and making it even higher, we know from evidence-based information, that's where most of these shootings are coming from. But I think if you start with the data, as opposed to how do I look, when a Democrat holds up an AR-15 in today's environment, I think they get political points. I think they actually win from it. I don't think they have any chance of getting it done, but I think they win politically from doing that. I think we need people to be less focused on how to win and more focused on what can we actually get done to see if we can make a difference on this. And my advice to people is try things. If it fails, you can change it and modify it as you go, but don't just give up not working on the problem. We're talking about babies and children and young people inside of our schools. We all should be concerned about that. And I also think that we should give the respect to the other side, that even though we may differ from them on some issues, that hopefully they have that same empathy as well.
Yeah, there's something else I would like to add to that, and that's employing a licensed psychologist in schools. I know it can be very costly, but if we're looking at actual prevention efforts, just as Paul was describing, a lot of these school shooters are students. Either were former students or current students. So they're coming from inside, not necessarily from outside. That's what that study was showing. And so if we actually have licensed psychologists employed and in all schools, then we can actually have professionals really doing this.
The pressure from a budgetary standpoint would not be to put on more psychologists, it'd be to put on more cops. I can tell you, I've been involved in the debate long enough to know that would be the pressure.
Sure.
Here's what I can also tell you. Watch these shootings. There are a lot of really good people out in the parking lot with guns that aren't making the difference that needs to be made. That doesn't mean they're bad cops. That has nothing to do with that. It means it's really hard to resolve the problem from that. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a police resource officer on your campus. But balancing those resources between psychology and enforcement and gun restriction is going to give you your best chance of being successful. Identifying the students who are at the most risk, trying to make certain that you're thinking through the issues that they're confronting. If you're going to solve this, to be dedicated to solving it. And again, in general, the way to resolve it, it's not going to be one thing. It just won't be.
Yeah, just to give you a statistic from the study, they found that over 90% of the time, school shooters targeted their own school. Just to really support where is this funding legislation really going, that these are people who are insiders, not necessarily outsiders. And public safety is also about training people in suicide prevention and funding therapists, as well as looking at safety parameters.
The Washington Post did a survey the other day following that shooting in Tennessee. And the survey results showed that AR-15 owners come from red and blue and purple states. They're significantly more likely to be white male and between the ages of 40 and 65, which is what you guys basically just said, white male. They're more likely to have higher incomes, to have served in the military, and to be Republican. And AR-15 owners are more likely to live in states former President Donald Trump won in 2020 than adults overall. Now, is there some connection here with political ideology that's getting in the way of meaningful action?
My own personal answer is yes, there is. But I'm going to go beyond just tying that to guns. Start with this. If you watch the nightly news or go online and get involved in social media, you are being bombarded by negative messages that are basically telling us this place is falling apart. That's what you're hearing. And by the way, I believe that's distorted. I believe that doesn't represent the reality. If you look at polling, you'll see that people say, well, I'm afraid my children aren't going to do as well in my country as I did, right? When I don't want to spend the whole show doing this, but I could spend the rest of the show showing you why I think our children are going to do a lot better than we did. I think they're going to be in a lot better position. The U.S. is an unrivaled superpower. Watch what's going on around the world. We thought Japan was going to replace us, and that went away. The idea that China is going to replace us is going to go away. But what they're watching is that it's falling apart. And then what happens is we have these tribal debates, right? Look, I was a Democratic mayor. I'm an independent today. But it isn't lost on me that there are excesses that exist on both the left and the right. The right's easy to see, right? If all you have to do is watch the Capitol riots to recognize the excesses on the right, and that there are some people, and I'm not going to say everyone on the right, but there are some people on the right who would like to burn down democracy. They think democracy is in the way of getting what they want. On the other hand, you have people who I think who are on the left who are promoting things like the 1619 Project, or that are promoting the idea. You'll hear these comments like white privilege or the patriarchy, but they're all things that separate us up by groups, right? They create an identification by group. In the book that Emily and I did, we took a look at terrorism, genocides, and extremist movements and tried to figure out what the connections were. And the thesis that we came away with is the very first thing is that in all those cases, they're tied to ideology, in all of them. Number two, in the ideologies that became violent, they separated people based upon the oppressed and the oppressor, right? Those ideologies that did that began to separate us up into groups, became more problematic. And third, it was addictive. That as people began to get into it, they would isolate people on the outside. They would attract people who were on the inside of the ideology. Oftentimes, those people were more violent. And as they themselves became isolated, the inclination for them to become more violent increased. Now, the question is, how do you solve it? Part of why we called it addictive ideologies is it is like an addiction. You have to solve this by looking at it like an addiction. And part of solving an addiction, as we all know, is you have to have some desire to want to. But that doesn't mean that family members and others can't organize on the outside to think about, hey, what role can we play in this process? Here's what I would tell you our starting point should be. If you want to be patriotic, quit insulting other Americans. Start with that. I have friends on the right and the left, and they're good people on both sides. I tend to believe that our society was built based upon the individual, that we empowered the individual. Now, that's happened not only through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it happened through the civil rights movement, the equal rights movement, the human rights movements. All those movements were about the importance of the individual. I think there are fringes on the right and the left whose excesses are trying to promote the idea that we're not individuals, that we're just simply part of a group. And we should wholeheartedly reject that. We should feel compelled in the least to try to defend them. None whatsoever, because they're part of the fairway that we grew up in that made this country what it was. And again, I think part of what we have to do is instead of spending our time trying to figure out why the other side's wrong, we got to start trying to figure out why the other side's saying what they're saying. We have to listen to them. I know I've been going on a few moments here, but I think the last thing I'll say is I'm not a Trump supporter. He is an anathema to everything that I believe in. But I look at his supporters, right? And I have friends that will say to me things about, if you voted for Trump the first time, I can forgive you. But if you did it a second time, you just must be a bad person. Look, the average Trump supporter is a little over 50 years old. He's a male. He has less than $1,000 in his bank account. Really? We can't find a way to reach out to them. We can't find a way to listen to what their concerns are and to try to understand where they're coming from. And allowing, again, this debate that we're having on guns. All right, maybe we can't come to resolution with you on AR-15. How about red flag laws? How about putting psychologists inside of campuses? How about a whole list of other things where maybe we can find some common ground?
Hallie, what are risk assessments?
Yeah, so risk assessments, it's better for obviously a trained professional to do them, but information that I can give to family members, community members, teachers, other people who are concerned about their loved ones is really looking at, so if somebody's at risk for suicide or homicide, so for suicidal risk assessments, you look at statements of intent. And do they have a plan in place? If so, how are they planning on taking their life? Are they talking about overdosing on pills, or are they just talking about like driving recklessly, or maybe abusing opiates with alcohol? And maybe it's not a very clear-cut plan, but maybe they're quite reckless in their decisions, that they're engaging behaviors really that are going to harm their lives and really a carelessness for their life. And if they've had any past suicidal gestures, like just saying things or like outbursts, I'd be happy if I didn't wake up tomorrow morning, or I wouldn't care if I died today. Or if you start seeing some other self-harming behaviors, if there are means to implement their plan, seeing if they actually have weapons, access to weapons. We tend to see males tend to die by self-injury with a gun, whereas women tend to overdose. or men tend to attempt by hanging. But there are all kinds of ways that people can attempt. So you want to take any of these statements very seriously. It can be very hard to sit with that discomfort. And this is honestly what I see when I'm talking to family members or legal teams about the risk of people that they're working with or that are in their lives, and saying, hey, they meet all of these really high risk factors. Let's develop a plan that is going to work and be most favorable for this person to get the help that they need. And really, they need to be in a secure environment. And they may not have the mental wherewithal to really appreciate that. If they have a history of mental illness, if they're actively psychotic, you may not be able to rationally talk to them or reason with them or have a logical conversation. That can all contribute to some of those risk factors. Paul mentioned before, like a history of trauma can put people at risk. If they've had previous suicides attempts, if they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, maybe they weren't suicidal or they had some lower threshold suicidal ideation, but as soon as their state of mind was impaired, then they're thinking more recklessly and really not making safe decisions for themselves. And social isolation is really a big one, or a lack of social support. If they're suffering from depression or anxiety disorders, if they have an ongoing pervasive personality disorder, any recent loss or trauma can also trigger suicide attempts or dangerousness to self. Any history of family suicide and poor physical health. So those are the risk factors for suicide. Now, danger to others, this is whether or not they have an intent to harm other people. I just met with somebody yesterday who verbalized in my office, somebody they felt had harmed them, had taken money from them. They were very paranoid. I don't know how much of this was even true, but there was definitely intent. He said, if I see this person, I'm going to kill him. And I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to see him, but I know where he works. I know where I can find him. So all of these things, if you're hearing somebody make those statements, you have to take it very seriously. And even if there isn't a solidified plan, obviously, if there is a solidified plan, I mean, call 911 right away, act on it right away. But even having some loose plans or even means, if they have access to means, access to weapons. But as we know, you don't necessarily need a gun to kill another person. There's all kinds of ways that you can act aggressively and violent towards another person to really hurt them and take their life. They have a history of anger and rage, a history of violence, any legal problems that they've had in the past, like domestic violence or aggravated assault charges. All of that can help inform and see that risk could be higher. Again, alcohol and drugs impairs decision making. Those are also risk factors. Presence of paranoid ideation, a fascination with weapons, fascination with mass shooters, as we saw with some of the copycat wanting to go out with a bang and also have fame and leave a legacy behind, and availability of weapons. All of those put someone at risk for homicide.
Okay. You talked a little while ago about treating ideological extremism as an addiction. Why is this categorization important in stopping mass murders?
Yeah, so with ideology, a lot of those risk factors that Paul and I described tend to be present for these people. I've done a lot of work in the forensic arena, evaluating people charged with domestic terrorism, different forms of extremism, incel ideology. And we see a lot of those personal risk factors that are present. I think what happens with extremism or this kind of addictive ideology is that something or some kind of rhetoric comes their view and it gives them a solution that is quite simplistic, and it gives them an answer and someone to blame. And I think people are, once they're primed, then they're willing to really do anything for that. And they're almost given this permission and condoning and justification for the violence because it's now embedded in part of this ideological bent and perspective. And so we start to see an increase in risk and violence. And as Paul was mentioning earlier, like that addictive behaviors that people tend to isolate themselves from others who think differently from them or who love them or want to protect them. They start to gravitate more towards people who have more of these extreme beliefs. And so they're more willing to engage in behaviors that they might not have otherwise. They're less likely to seek mental health treatment or help. And they just get more and more radicalized, and you keep slipping. It's hard to stop that train once you're on it. And this is why Paul and I really found the purpose and meaning in writing this book and really trying to prevent and help educate people, but also prevent people from moving in that direction, and really wanting to protect our country from moving in a direction that we saw happening with growing rise of extremism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate. Hate is addictive. People can feel really powerful, and especially when they feel such a lack of control or a loss of identity, a lack of meaning in their lives, if there's something that's helping them to feel powerful. And hate can fill that void, but it's very damaging and destructive.
That's the question to think about. Because again, we've said in the beginning, we looked at extremism in the U.S. We also looked at terrorism, which Emily has spent a lot of time on doing evals on inside of prisons with people who are involved in Islamic terrorism, all the way to incel terrorism, but genocide. And here's the question I would get you to think about. So we interviewed lots of different people. We went to a number of different Holocaust type sites, places where genocides had been committed. One of them, a good friend of mine, two good friends of ours were involved with, was what happened in Bosnia with Milosevic. Now, we knew from aerial photos that Milosevic was opening up ditches and literally having these mass burials of thousands of people, hundreds or thousands of people that they would bury in these ditches. One of our friends was in one of the camps. He was slated for ethnic cleansing. But one of the stories that we got was that there were a group of U.S. troops that were approaching a ditch. At the ditch were some guys with backhoes shoving dirt down in on the ditch, and a bunch of people with shovels putting dirt down in the ditch. None of them soldiers. When they saw the American troops, they ran away. When the American troops got there, the people they were throwing dirt down on were still alive. There were children inside the ditch. Here's the question. How do people get there? What is it that takes place that gets someone there? I think one of the people to listen to that really is instructive on this was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, he talks about he had been in a German prisoner of war camp, and then he ended up being sent to the Gulag because Stalin really didn't know what to do with him. But when he got to the Gulag, instead of focusing on what Stalin had done wrong to him or the Communist Party had done wrong to him, he said that he began to focus on his own accountability. And he thought back to when he was a captain. He was sent out to the front by the Communist Party to take kulaks, which were basically poor farmers that had been identified as being wealthy farmers because they had one cow instead of none. And they said, your job is to move these people off the farms, because they were going to take them off, then take the remaining farmers, move them over to it, utilize the revenue that would come from that to feed the Communist Party. But what he had been told was, these are capitalists. They're people who are landowners, and landowners are the enemy of the people. And he said, so what I was able to do is, he said, all of us have good and evil inside of us, but I was able to take that evil inside of me and export it to those kulaks. He took 10,000 people to Siberia, 10,000 families, 60,000 people. All of them died the first winter. Here's the question when you think about this. What's going on in this? The ideology allows us to shift that evil that's inside of us over onto another group of people because of the group that they're in. Again, all ideologies that begin to become violent separate people based upon the oppressed and the oppressor. And the minute you start hearing that language, we're on dangerous ground, because now we're starting to allow people to objectify the other person. Our magic, The magic of who we are is that we've always seen people as individuals. One of my favorite human beings ever made the comment that we shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And to me, that doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're a capitalist or someone who is working in social programs. It doesn't matter if you're Black or white or Hispanic or gay. Each of us have the right to be seen as an individual. I think when we lose that, I think when we start seeing people as part of a group, we're on the way to being in trouble. And what's happening today is that there are lots of different economic reasons why we're being separated up. Politicians benefit from separating us up. They benefit by appealing to your negative bias. Political parties benefit from it. The news media benefits from it to get you to keep watching the show tomorrow. Social marketing benefit from it to get you to spend more time on watching what's going on. You have to find alternatives to that information. Now, I look at politics. When I was involved in politics 25 years ago, I knew more about politics than almost anybody I knew, right? Today, I get in a taxi, and taxi drivers know more about politics than I know, right? And everybody knows something about politics. What happened? I don't know all of it, but I know that those tweets that used to come out by Donald Trump and the 24-hour news cycle by the news media that started making us think about politics all year long had an effect on us. During the time that I was in, people would get involved with it about 4 or 5 months before the race, and they'd get more active and they'd understand the issues, and then they'd leave it and put it behind them. Right now, we're constantly engaged in it. Politics is the place we go to resolve our problems. Of course, there are going to be challenges there. Sometimes we have to let go of it and move on to the other things that make life enriched.
I just wonder why it is, Paul, that when you were mayor of Phoenix, you showed a lot of courage, and the NRA all upset what you were working on and some of the actions that you took and were able to get implemented. Why is it today that so many politicians are afraid to do anything about this thing, even though they'll say how tragic it is and how they want to protect our kids and all of that? They always throw it back to say it's a mental health issue, not a gun issue.
First, I would tell you this. There's some people on the right that I've listened to who are willing to stand up. They don't get a lot of exposure. How much exposure did Mitt Romney get? The people who are willing to be in the middle of the road, and even though he's a conservative, John McCain was a very good friend of mine. John McCain, right? Those people have become isolated out. And it's not just because they're not in power. It's because they're not as sexy politically. They're not as sexy to pay attention to. The people who go work out our problems, we oftentimes don't focus on. So I'm going to say that part of the problem isn't all theirs. I think there are brave people that are still there. We just don't give them the credit for it. Second, the reward system's problematic. I think that what our partisan system has done has been challenging for us. By the way, I think if you're going to fix the problem, there are 3 things that you have to do. The first issue you have to do is we have to change the political system. We have a political system today where the incentives are built based upon you appealing to your base. So remember, I ran in an election that was an open election. Everybody had a chance to vote on me in the primary and in the general. It was a nonpartisan election. So I had to go talk to Republican voters, Democratic voters, independent voters, every election. Well, in 435 seats in the United States today, 400 of them are gerrymandered to the point that there isn't even a general election that matters, right? The decision's made in the primary. And in the primary, if you do the numbers, about 70% of the people are registered, about 30% are Democrat, 30% are Republican, about 40% are independents, about 44% are independents. Of the 30% that are Democrats, take that 70% by the 30%, you're down to 20%. Turnout for 30%, you're talking about 6 to 8% of the voters vote in those primaries. And then they face no opposition in the general. That gives them a clear incentive to appeal to the extreme. Issue number 1, we have to take power away from these political parties. We don't need to get rid of them. They have a right to exist. But we need to make certain that We don't allow these extremists to have representation that's disproportionate to their actual number. That most people do not buy into what the radical left or the radical right is talking about. Number two, I think you need some civics in our educational system. I think we need to teach why the American system has a benefit, why the idea that we based ourselves on individualism was a benefit to us. And then the third issue is individual responsibility. It's looking at our own accountability in the process and thinking about what role am I playing in this? I know one of the issues I had with one of my brothers, he was a far right winger. We got into a fight one day and I said something insulting to him. I said, well, what'd you do? Did you watch that on Fox News? That one little comment, he didn't talk to me for a month. Now, I love him. He should have not talked to me for a month. But I also shouldn't have said that. I didn't need to say that. We have to quit letting go of the people we love for people we don't even know. We don't know these people at the political level. So what my brother is on the far right side? Just love him, be there for him, listen to him, try to understand where he's coming from, dig in a little bit deeper if you need to. But that's the role that we play as individuals.
Okay, guys, let's talk a little bit about your book. We're coming down the home stretch here. Tell us about it and how it might help, and where can people find it?
One thing I'd like to add is part of looking at the genocide and growing extremism and terrorism. We also looked at my family's story of surviving persecution in Iraq as a case illustration for how this happens. So my parents are from Baghdad, and they suffered persecution for being a minority, for being Jewish. My father tells a story of when he was 19 years old, he was riding his bicycle, and he came to the main Tahrir Square, and he saw that there was a commotion. And as he approaches the square, he sees that there were Jewish men and two boys who were being hanged at the gallows in the main square. And people were cheering and rejoicing, dancing and celebrating around these dead bodies. And when my father went back and was listening to the news to see what was going on, he saw that there was a mock trial, and these Jewish male members of society were falsely accused for being spies for Israel. And it was a political propaganda ploy by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party, who was rising to power at the time, to incite violence against a group, against the Jews. We can look historically at how that came to be, but the main thing is this can happen anywhere at any time. It's not a foreign problem or a foreigner problem. We just saw this with the insurgency at the Capitol. This can happen here. It does happen here. It has historically happened here. And I think once we remove ourselves from that delusion, we'll be able to really see like the good and evil exists in us all. And we have to exercise personal agency at the individual level for being responsible and accountable for the choices that we make and what we allow ourselves to be manipulated by whether we're misinformed or we're just going along with the status quo, or I'd rather it happen to them than me, whatever kind of attitude, and not having the courage, as you were talking about courage before, not having the courage to really stand up for what you believe in, even if it goes against or defies the people that are around you. It takes a lot of strength to be able to do that, but really learning to trust yourself. And so the main thing, my parents escaped. My mother's father was abducted by the government, never seen from or heard from again. He was taken to a prison called the Palace of No Return. It was similar to Abu Ghraib. They were torturing people. No one ever left, and you never heard from them again. No confirmation of death. And so my mother ended up having to escape after 6 months of his disappearance with her siblings. She had just started college and start a whole new life in Israel. Fortunately, the U.S. was helping these refugees in surrounding Arab countries with Operation Ezra, Operation Nehemiah, to help them seek safe passage and resettlement in Israel. But the main thing is, these were my mother's friends. These were her schoolmates. These were her neighbors. These were people she grew up with, that one day they turned on her and they were preventing Jewish students from entering in schools. They were calling them names, harassing them. And these were people that they helped do their homework with. To go from such a personal level to just automatically turn. This can happen here. It does happen here, and it can happen to us. But we have to really hold ourselves accountable.
Okay. So talk to me a little bit about your book and how it might help people.
Maybe I'll hit on that a little bit. The book is Addictive Ideologies. Again, it utilizes Emily's family as the case study. It also lays out 7 ideals of agency. So besides the political reforms and the educational reforms, the real question is, what can we do as individuals? Those include things like knowing the truth, understanding that the world is in better shape than you think, and the U.S. is in an unbelievable position today. It's our own sense of accountability, that we're individuals, that we owe that same respect back to other people, the ability to find meaning, which you generally find in what you create, who you love, your service to other people, or in struggle, but also in love and connection and a sense of belonging. It outlines kind of the details of how it is that we can help find that and what we can do to help other people when we begin to see that they're getting trapped into these addictive ideologies as well. You can buy that, by the way, on any major stand, but Amazon has it, or you can pick up a copy at Audible.
Okay, once again, the title of the book is Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency When Politics Fail You. And I encourage people to check it out. This is a really difficult problem that we're all facing today.
Yeah.
And Dr. Emily Bashah and Paul Johnson have done a great job of putting this together. And I think it's worth your while to check it out. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate you joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I'd like to end on a quote. So Viktor Frankl was an Auschwitz concentration camp survivor in the Holocaust. His whole entire family was perished and murdered. And when he went back to his hometown after surviving Auschwitz, everything was decimated his whole life. And he committed himself to healing from this struggle through finding meaning and purpose in his life. And that was to help people who were suicidal. And one of the things that he says is, when you're confronted with a situation which is unresolvable and unchangeable, you are forced to change yourself. And I think that he is such a hero for me and for clients and people that I work with. And I think his teachings are incredible. And if we could look at a man like that, who is able to find meaning and purpose after all that he survived, and that he allowed himself to be transformed because of his struggle, there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth. And I think so many people do have incredible stories. I just shared parts of my family's history and story. And I think that if people can find their identity in their struggle, that it will serve them rather than trying to stifle it and be angry and vengeful and hateful towards others as a result of it. That there can be some inner healing that can help promote transformation.
Excellent. Paul, do you have anything else to add?
Just first thanking both of you for putting on your program. I had when I was 29 years old or 30 years old, Ronald Reagan had just retired, and he came to Arizona to give a speech. And as it turned out, Tip O'Neill was there, and both of them ended up sitting at a table and talking after this dinner. And I had a chance to be able to meet with both of them. I listened to them for about an hour. And I remember I asked Ronald Reagan at the end of the dinner if he had any advice for me as a young mayor. And he said, "Oh, that's easy, Mayor." He liked to use that word. He said, "The answer is," he said, "you've got to make certain that you leave them with hope." Now, there was another guy there at that dinner by the name of Pierre Salinger, that those of us who are a little older will remember his role. He knew John F. Kennedy, worked with him as a speechwriter. But when those two left, Pierre said, "Oh my gosh, John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan are so much alike." And I said, how is that? And he said, look, he said, these two people have a very optimistic view of our country and who we are. He said, they just have a different way of trying to approach the problem. I think that's what we need to get back to. We need to get back to, instead of seeing this as a right and left, maybe we need to start seeing it as the people who believe that everything that is happening is apocryphal. And those people who have a belief and a hope that we're going to be okay, maybe just a different approach as to how to solve the problems. Try to listen and learn from both sides. But anyway, thank you again for having us on the program.
I thank you guys for joining us and sharing your wisdom about this really difficult situation that this country is facing today. So thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.